Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here for this one.
Yeah, I am really excited about today's topic because today we are taking a deep dive into an idea that is, honestly, without exaggeration, one of the most dangerous concepts ever introduced into human history.
Oh, absolutely. Dangerous in the best possible way.
Exactly. We are doing a really comprehensive, historical, philosophical, and, modern exploration of this incredibly simple two-word Latin phrase, sapere aude,
Sapere Aude, yeah.
which is most commonly translated as dare to know. But right out of the gate, I really want to frame the stakes for you, the listener, because you are sitting at the table with us today, and I want to be clear that this is not some dusty academic history lesson.
Right. We're not just going to recite ancient poetry and, pat ourselves on the back for sounding cultured.
No, not at all. We are exploring an urgent existential toolkit here. Because when you look at the architecture of our modern world, we are completely surrounded by, well, algorithmic manipulation. We have these hermetically sealed digital echo chambers.
And this very insidious, quiet form of institutional dogmatism everywhere.
Exactly. The fundamental ability to just use your own understanding, to genuinely think for yourself without a digital or like a social crutch, it is under absolute siege right now.
It really is. The pressure to conform is immense.
So our mission in this deep dive is to trace the spark of this intellectual rebellion. We're going to track it from its birth in Roman antiquity right through the explosive era of the Enlightenment all the way to our current totally bewildering age of artificial intelligence. We want to pull out the raw insights you need to reclaim your autonomous mind.
And, to do that effectively, we have to start by completely redefining what we think knowledge actually is in the first place.
Okay, yeah, how so?
Well, because as you go through the source material we've gathered for this, a really staggering core thesis emerges. And it's that truly knowing something is intrinsically destructive.
Destructive.
Yeah, destructive. We are conditioned to think of knowledge as this passive possession, right? Like a trophy we put on a shelf or a credential we just slap on our resume.
Right, like I learned a fact, now I own it.
Exactly. But Sapere proposes that knowledge is an active destabilizing force. It shatters your comfort zones. It inherently threatens whatever status quo you rely on for psychological safety.
Wow, okay.
To truly dare to know demands total existential responsibility. It means looking at the world and making determinations without relying on any external authority, whether that's a king, a priest, a political party, or even just a search engine to tell you what is real.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to know where this explosive little phrase actually originates. In the popular imagination, I think we almost exclusively associate it with the 18th century Enlightenment, right?
Yeah, mostly with Kant.
Right, but the origin of the spark goes back much, much further. It goes back to a Roman poet and this really vivid image of a rather foolish rustic.
It does. The historical foundation takes us all the way back to the 1st century BC. The phrase was first penned by the really renowned Roman lyric poet Horace.
Horace, okay.
Yeah, in a collection of his called the Epistulae, or the Letters. And specifically, the second letter of his first book is addressed to this young man named Lollius Maximus.
And who was he?
Lollius was this young guy studying rhetoric in Rome. He was gearing up to enter the brutal, highly competitive arena of public life and politics. So Horace is acting as a mentor here, right?
Giving him some life advice.
Exactly. And he drops this incredibly dense line in Latin. He says, "Dimidium facti qui coepit, habet sapere aude incipe."
Okay, my Latin is a bit rusty.
Fair enough. It essentially translates to, he who has begun has half the deed done, dare to be wise, begin.
Dare to be wise, begin. I love that. And Horace doesn't just leave it as this abstract piece of motivational advice either.
No, he anchors it with a metaphor.
Right, this metaphor that is just so visceral. He describes this rustic as like a foolish country bumpkin who needs to get to the other side of a river.
Yeah, it's such a great image.
It really is. But instead of, building a bridge or finding a shallow ford or just plunging into the water to swim across, this guy just stands on the riverbank and waits.
He just waits.
He is literally waiting for the water to completely run dry so he can walk across without getting his feet wet.
It is the sheer tragic absurdity of the image that makes it last so long. Horace observes that the rustic waits for the river to pass, but the river flows, and it will continue to flow on into eternity.
The water is never going to stop.
Never.
It is the ultimate timeless analogy for human procrastination, isn't it? I mean, we sit on the banks of our own lives waiting for the quote-unquote perfect time or the perfect external conditions to make a difficult
Or
change.
to adopt a new worldview. Yeah.
Right. Or to seek out a difficult truth. We tell ourselves, I'll start thinking critically about my career when things calm down at work.
Or I'll challenge my family's toxic political views when it's less risky for my social standing at Thanksgiving.
Exactly. But life is this flowing, volatile, dangerous river. The current of time and events is not going to politely pause so you can cross safely.
No, it won't.
If you want to get to the truth, you have to step into the freezing water. You have to get wet. You have to risk being swept away.
And that element of risk is deeply embedded in the etymology of the phrase itself. If we break down the Latin root of sapere aude, we find something quite profound in the word sapere.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, in our modern context, when we hear dare to know, we immediately jump to a very dry, cognitive, strictly intellectual kind of knowing.
Right, like memorizing the periodic table.
Or solving an algebraic equation. But sapere means something much more biological. It literally means to taste.
To taste, wow.
Yeah, it means to perceive, to have good flavor, or to savor the essence of life.
So it's not just data processing, it's sensory. It's deeply experiential.
Completely. I mean, it is the root of the English words savant and sage, and it forms the basis of sapientia, which is wisdom.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. So when Horace says sapere aude, he isn't just saying dare to calculate or dare to memorize. He is calling for a holistic, intuitive, lived experience of understanding. It's the difference between reading a menu and actually tasting the meal.
You cannot know the truth through hearsay. You must digest it yourself.
Exactly.
That makes perfect sense of Abraham Cowley's 17th century translation.
Yeah.
Because Cowley, who is this English writer, he translated Horace's phrase as venture to be wise.
Oh, I like that.
I've always loved that specific word choice, venture. It frames the act of thinking not as a passive contemplation, but as an enterprise, like an expedition into the unknown.
You don't venture from the safety of an armchair.
Exactly. It implies that seeking wisdom is a bold, active undertaking that comes with a very real possibility of failure or injury.
And because it implies such risk, it didn't take long for the phrase to mutate. I mean, it started as Horace's moral advice against personal procrastination, but as history marched on, it evolved into something deeply subversive.
How did it evolve?
Well, by the 4th century AD, the theologian Augustine of Hippo picked it up. He was writing a philosophical dialogue to a man named Evodius. And in a fascinating twist, Augustine uses sapere aude to explicitly instruct Evodius not to rely blindly on authority.
Wait, Augustine, a theologian,
Yes.
is telling someone not to rely on authority.
Yes, and that even included Augustine's own authority as a teacher. He is essentially warning Evodius that if he doesn't dare to use his own mind, fear will subjugate his intellect before reason even has a chance to operate.
That is a massive turning point for the idea. It goes from don't procrastinate on your personal goals to defend the sovereignty of your own mind against the people in charge.
It was the first major pivot. And that thread lay dormant for centuries until it was seized upon in the 17th century by the French astronomer and philosopher Pierre Gassendi.
Okay, bringing science into it.
Exactly.
Well.
He used sapere aude as a literal rallying cry against the stifling dogmas of Aristotelian physics and scholasticism that dominated the universities of his day. So the phrase was quietly gaining momentum, gathering philosophical weight, and preparing the ground for the intellectual supernova of the 18th century.
Which brings us to the man who turned this obscure piece of Latin poetry into a global manifesto. If Horace carved the stone, Immanuel Kant built the cathedral.
He really did.
In 1784, Kant published an essay that essentially defined an entire era of human history. The essay was titled, "What is Enlightenment?"
And in that single, relatively brief text, Kant formalized what had previously been a loosely connected cultural atmosphere. He gave the Enlightenment a precise definition.
And what was that definition?
He wrote that enlightenment is humanity's emergence from its self-incurred immaturity, or, depending on the translation you read, its self-incurred guardianship or tutelage.
The word self-incurred is what makes his diagnosis so shocking to me, even as a modern reader. Because Kant is looking around at a society that is largely obedient, largely uncritical, and he says, this immaturity, this tragic inability to use your own understanding without someone else holding your hand, it's not caused by a lack of intelligence.
No, not at all.
People aren't biologically stupid. They're choosing this state because of laziness and cowardice.
What's fascinating here is how clinically Kant dissects the psychology of voluntary submission. He realized that people willingly remain under guardianship because genuine thinking is agonizing work.
It's hard.
It takes caloric energy, it causes anxiety. When you think for yourself, you lose the safety net of the crowd.
Right.
You might arrive at a conclusion that alienates your friends, your family, or your employer. So human beings find an incredible seductive comfort in handing over their existential autonomy to guardians.
The sources pull some incredibly specific examples straight from Kant's text to illustrate exactly how this works mechanically in daily life.
Oh, his examples are great.
They are so relatable. Kant writes, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but he says, if I have a book that understands for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience, and a physician who dictates my diet, I don't need to trouble myself at all. He is pointing out the absolute luxury of outsourced thinking. As long as you have the money to pay them or the social obedience to follow them, other people will gladly take on the terrifying burden of managing your reality.
And Kant is very clear that these guardians, like, the state bureaucrats, the religious authorities, the dogmatic academics, they are not innocent service providers.
They're not just helping out.
No, they actively cultivate this state of infantile dependence. They do it by deliberately exaggerating the dangers of walking on your own.
How do they do that?
They build a narrative that says, if you try to think outside the approved bounds, you will fall into heresy, you will ruin your health, you will destroy the social fabric, you will descend into madness.
Wow.
They frame intellectual independence as a mortal threat to the individual. So Kant looks at this miserable, comfortable state of mass cowardice, and he drops the hammer. He declares that the absolute motto of the Enlightenment must be Sapere Aude, have the courage to use your own reason.
I have to admit, though, there is a profound, almost comical irony when we examine Kant, the man alongside Kant, the philosopher.
Oh, the irony is thick.
Because when you read What is Enlightenment, it reads like it was written by a swashbuckling revolutionary. You picture a guy on horseback, sword in hand, storming the barricades.
Like a romantic hero.
Yes. But Immanuel Kant's actual life was the polar opposite of a romantic rebellion.
He was, in many ways, the ultimate caricature of a rigid, pedantic 18th century academic.
Exactly. The poet Heinrich Heine made this brutal joke about him. He said that Immanuel Kant had neither life nor history.
Ouch.
I know.
Yeah.
And Friedrich Nietzsche later mocked his rigidity by calling him Königsberg's Chinaman, implying he was this mechanical, unfeeling rule follower.
Kant was a frail, physically unimposing man who barely stood 5 feet tall.
Right. And he never traveled more than a few dozen miles outside of his hometown of Königsberg in his entire life.
Never. He was so obsessively attached to his daily routine that his biographer noted the local housewives would literally set their clocks by the exact moment Kant walked past their windows on his daily constitutional.
Wait, literally set their clock?
Literally. Every single day at the exact same time. He lived a completely ascetic, isolated life with an old servant, and he would allegedly lose his temper if a single pair of scissors in his study was moved out of its precise designated place.
And yet, despite existing in this hyper-controlled, incredibly mundane physical bubble, his mind was a weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the foundations of dogma.
It really was.
The English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously remarked that Kant struck the intellectual world with a giant's fist. He didn't need to physically travel or fight in wars to be dangerous. He subjected every single human institution, religion, law, metaphysics, empirical science, to the merciless, unforgiving critique of pure reason.
But, his physical reality brings up a very practical, complex problem.
What's that?
Well, Kant lived as a subject under the absolute monarchy of the Prussian king, Frederick the Great. If you are a philosopher in 1784 and your core message is reject all authority and trust only your own mind, you are inevitably going to trigger anarchy.
Oh, for sure.
And monarchs tend to respond to anarchy by hanging the philosophers who started it.
Yeah, historically speaking, that doesn't end well for the philosopher.
Exactly. So how does one actually practice Sapere Aude in a highly restrictive, heavily policed society without just braining the whole structure down and getting executed?
Right. How do you do it?
This is where Kant demonstrates a level of strategic political genius that goes far beyond abstract philosophy. He understood the razor-thin political tightrope he had to walk.
He had to be careful.
Very careful. He desperately wanted to plant the seeds of true intellectual freedom, but he also understood that if society collapsed into violent, bloody chaos, the fragile space required for reason and debate would be destroyed along with it.
So what was his solution?
To solve this, he devised a brilliant, highly asymmetrical framework. He split human reason into two distinct categories: the private use of reason and the public use of reason.
Okay, this concept can be a bit counterintuitive at first. Let's break down the mechanics here. What exactly constitutes the private use of reason in Kant's model?
So, in Kant's vocabulary, the private use of reason refers to the way you think and act when you are occupying a specific civil post or carrying out a professional role.
Like a job.
Exactly. Imagine you are a tax collector, a military officer, or a clergyman employed by the state church. In those specific capacities, Kant argues, you are a cog in the machine of society. You have voluntarily accepted a job that requires you to execute certain duties for the functioning of the state.
Right.
Therefore, in your private role as an employee or an official, your reason must be restricted. If the army gives an order, the officer must obey. If the state levies a tax, the collector must gather it. Obedience is required to prevent immediate societal collapse.
I have to push back on this, though, because it feels like a massive contradiction.
It does sound like one, yeah.
If I am a soldier and I'm told to just shut off my critical faculties and obey the general's orders while I'm in uniform, isn't that the exact opposite of Sapere Aude? Isn't Kant just providing a very sophisticated philosophical excuse for dictators?
I see what you mean.
He's basically saying, sure, you can have your little enlightenment inside your own head, but out here in the real world, you do exactly what the king says.
It absolutely sounds like a capitulation to tyranny on the surface. But when you look at the second half of the equation, the subversive mechanism reveals itself.
Okay, lay it on me.
Kant pairs this restricted private obedience with the absolute freedom of the public use of reason. He defines the public use of reason as the way you think and communicate when you step outside your professional role and address the entire literate reading public as a scholar.
As a scholar, okay.
Right. In this public arena, Kant insists your reason must be completely unrestricted by any authority.
Okay, let's play this out with an analogy to see how it works.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the soldier on the battlefield has to follow the general's highly flawed, potentially disastrous strategy because the immediate survival of the unit depends on chain of command?
Yes.
But the moment that soldier goes on leave, he has the philosophical right to write a scathing, analytically rigorous pamphlet exposing the general's incompetence and publish it for the whole country to read.
That is the exact mechanism. The tax collector cannot refuse to collect the tax while on duty, but as a scholar in the public sphere, he has total freedom to publish a rigorous economic treatise demonstrating exactly why the tax system is mathematically corrupt and morally bankrupt.
Wow. Okay.
Kant summarized this delicate, paradoxical balance by famously praising the enlightened despotism of Frederick the Great with a specific formula. He said, argue as much as you will, and about what you will, only obey.
It's a Trojan horse.
Yes.
It looks like a gift of obedience to the king, but it's hiding an army of critics inside.
It is arguably the most successful Trojan horse in political philosophy. Kant knew that violent revolutions often just replace one tyrant with another. But if you protect the space for scholars to fearlessly utilize their public reason, a slow alchemy happens.
The ideas spread.
Over years and decades, their rational critiques seep into the consciousness of the reading public. The public begins to see the flaws in the system, and eventually, the despotic institutions themselves are forced to adapt, or they slowly crumble from the inside out, completely dismantled by logic rather than by guillotines.
It is incredible.
Rulers constantly make the mistake of thinking they can domesticate intellectuals. As Jean-Jacques Rousseau noted, rulers often tolerate the arts and sciences merely to decorate our chains with flour.
Decorate our chains, wow.
They want intellectuals to make their tyranny look cultured. But Kant's application of Sapere Aude isn't about decorating the chains. It's a slow, methodical, unstoppable process of applying corrosive acid to the chains until the iron simply gives way.
That is a brilliant way to understand how philosophical leverage actually works against entrenched power. So we've seen how this spark operates in the realm of political theory and sociology. Now, I want to pivot and look at how this plays out in physical reality.
Let's do it.
Let's rewind the clock slightly from Kant back to the 16th and 17th centuries, right into the heart of the scientific revolution. Because this is the arena where Sapere Aude stops being a debate about human nature and becomes a weaponized tool used to literally redefine the universe.
We're talking about Galileo and his telescope.
Exactly.
Galileo is perhaps the ultimate historical embodiment of daring to know in the face of absolute peril. What he staged was an empirical rebellion.
Set the scene for us. What was he up against?
Well, for over a millennium, the established model of the cosmos was the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic system. This was a geocentric model.
Meaning Earth is at the center.
Right, meaning the Earth was fixed, completely unmoving, at the exact center of the universe. And all heavenly bodies, which were considered perfectly smooth and divine, revolved around us.
And it's crucial to understand that this geocentric model wasn't just a prevailing scientific hypothesis that people were open to debating. It was theological infrastructure.
Yes, very much so.
The Catholic Church had integrated Aristotelian physics into its interpretation of Scripture. The Earth was the center of the universe because humanity was the center of God's drama. To suggest otherwise wasn't just bad math. It was heresy. It was an attack on the divine order.
Precisely. The epistemological rule of the day was deductive reasoning based on authority. The Church said the heavens were perfect and earth-centric, therefore any observation to the contrary must be an illusion.
Right. Trust the book, not your eyes.
But Galileo completely flips the epistemology. He embraces inductive reasoning. He doesn't go to the library to read Aristotle to find out how the sky works. He builds an improved telescope, an extension of human perception, and he simply points it upward.
And the specific things he saw, which he published in 1610 in his treatise Sidereus and Nuncius, the starry messenger acted like a sledgehammer against the glass sphere of Aristotelian physics.
It really did.
He looked at Jupiter and saw smaller bodies, moons, orbiting around it. Mechanically, why was that so devastating to the old worldview?
Because the core premise of the geocentric model was that the Earth is the only center of motion in the universe. Everything must orbit us.
Everything.
Yes, so when Galileo sees moons orbiting Jupiter, he proves definitively that there are multiple centers of motion. The underlying physics engine of the Ptolemaic model simply breaks.
It shatters.
Furthermore, he looked at our moon and saw jagged craters, mountains, and valleys. He saw spots on the sun. He saw the rings of Saturn and the phases of Venus.
He proved that the heavens aren't made of some perfect, unblemished ethereal substance. They are made of rocks and dirt and chaotic matter, just like the Earth. He brings the heavens down to our level.
He empirically validated the Copernican heliocentric theory that the Earth is just another planet orbiting the sun. But in doing so, the telescope became an epistemological threat. By trusting his own sensory data over the decrees of the Pope, Galileo was enacting the most dangerous form of Sapere Aude.
And the visceral danger of that act cannot be overstated. Daring to know has an incredibly steep price.
It cost him dearly.
In 1616, the Roman Inquisition officially warned Galileo to abandon his Copernican views. The works of Copernicus were banned, but Galileo was trapped by the truth. He couldn't unsee the moons of Jupiter. His mind was no longer subordinate to the Church's narrative.
He couldn't just pretend he didn't know.
Right. So he eventually published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which directly mocked the geocentric view. And for that, in 1633, he was dragged before the Inquisition.
He was an old man by this point. He was threatened with physical torture.
Wait, actual torture?
Yes, actual physical torture. He was forced to publicly abjure, to kneel, and formally curse and renounce his own scientific findings. His books were banned, and he spent the remainder of his life under strict house arrest.
It's a tragic story on a personal level. But structurally, it was a massive victory for human reason. Galileo paid an unimaginable price, but his absolute refusal to let the Inquisition act as the pastor of his scientific conscience altered the trajectory of the human species.
It changed everything.
He proved that physical reality does not respond to institutional decrees. You can threaten a mathematician with fire, but it won't stop the Earth from moving. His defiance cracked the monopoly on truth and directly paved the way for thinkers like René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and John Locke. He demonstrated that the human mind, armed with empirical evidence, has the power to conquer millennia of inherited ignorance.
And this naturally cascades into the next monumental shift in human history. Once you establish that an individual human mind, utilizing reason and observation, can accurately map the mechanics of the solar system, a very dangerous secondary question arises in the minds of the public.
Oh, I can guess. If the king and the church were completely wrong about the stars, what else are they wrong about?
That is the exact logical leap that terrifies despots. If the king isn't ruling by some divine, cosmically ordained right because the cosmos doesn't work the way the king said it did, then how does he derive his power?
Right. If the science is wrong, the political theory is wrong.
Exactly. The scientific validation of human reason bled directly into political philosophy. If every human being possesses an inherent rational agency, if we all have the capacity to dare to know, then we are not the property of the monarch. We possess natural rights. Philosophy leaves the observatory and enters the courtroom. The abstract idea becomes codified law.
We see this eruption most clearly in the late 18th century. Look at the French Revolution. In 1789, the National Constituent Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
A monumental document.
The preamble to this document is one of the most remarkable things ever written. It doesn't just list rights, it provides a philosophical justification. It explicitly states that ignorance, forgetfulness, or contempt for the rights of man are the sole causes of public calamities and the corruption of governments.
That phrasing is critical. It is essentially Kantian philosophy translated into legal architecture. It declares that human beings must be treated as ends in themselves, not merely as biological tools or tax-generating units for the state to use.
Right.
And this legal evolution didn't stop in the 18th century. If we fast forward through the absolute devastation of the 20th century, emerging from the horrors of the Second World War, we arrive at the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations.
The UDHR basically takes Sapere Aude and makes it the global standard.
Yeah.
It asserts that every individual on the planet has inherent dignity and the right to freedom of opinion and expression.
And as we move into the modern era, the application of this idea takes on fascinating new dimensions. Today, daring to know isn't just about having the political right to speak without being arrested. It's about having access to the raw materials of knowledge. This is why we see Sapere Aude manifesting as the A2K movement, access to knowledge.
Right, A2K.
Activists argue that access to information is a fundamental human right.
We see it in the push for open source software, where the code that runs our world isn't locked in a corporate black box, but is transparent and modifiable by anyone.
Yes, open source is a great example.
And we see it in the fierce demand for open access scientific journals. If taxpayer money funds vital medical research, why is the resulting data locked behind a $40 paywall controlled by a massive publishing conglomerate?
Exactly.
The core argument is that you cannot physically dare to know if the structural pathways to knowledge are guarded by corporate toll booths.
It highlights the absolute universality of the concept. The desire for an autonomous mind isn't just a Western European phenomenon. Our source material details a brilliant cross-cultural example of this exact same philosophical spark catching fire elsewhere.
Oh, right, the Ottoman example.
Yes. If we look at 19th century Ottoman modernizations, specifically during the Tanzimat period, we see a society grappling with existential decline. The intellectuals of that era realized that military or administrative tweaks weren't enough. To save their society from collapse, they had to fundamentally shift the epistemology of the culture.
They needed a paradigm shift.
They had to adopt a rational, empirical approach to the world and break free from the paralysis of pure traditionalism.
They recognized that you can't build a modern state on an intellectual foundation that outlaws curiosity. One of the most celebrated poets of that era wrote a poem addressed to the youth, urging them to embrace the future. He penned a line that so perfectly distills the essence of everything we've been talking about.
It's a great line.
And it was a line that was later formally adopted by the founder of the modern republic as the core educational philosophy of the nation. The line is, free in thought, free in understanding, free in conscience.
It's beautiful.
It really is. It is Horace's ancient Roman call to action, echoing centuries later in a completely different cultural context, proving that the hunger to own your own mind is a baseline human condition.
It is a soaring, beautiful sentiment. It envisions a human mind completely free from the mortgage of any external authority.
So if we pause here, we have a wonderfully triumphant, almost cinematic narrative. Reason conquers religious dogma. Science charts the heavens. Human rights are legally codified across the globe. Everyone learns to think for themselves, and we all live happily ever after in a utopia of logic.
It sounds like a fairy tale ending.
It does.
Yeah.
But here is where the story gets incredibly dark and vastly more complex. In the 19th and 20th centuries, some of those brilliant philosophical minds looked at this triumphant march of universal reason and asked a terrifying, disruptive question.
A very necessary question.
They asked, is this universal enlightenment reason truly liberating us, or is it just a new, more sophisticated tyrant wearing a different mask?
This is the arrival of the postmodern hammer. It is the inevitable counter-rebellion against the Enlightenment itself. And to understand it, we need to examine the incredibly nuanced critique leveled by the 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Okay, Foucault.
In 1984, which was, quite deliberately, exactly 200 years after Kant published his famous essay, Foucault published his own essay. And he gave it the exact same title, What is enlightenment?
A brilliantly cheeky move. He is directly challenging the ghost of Kant.
He was. Foucault described his approach as a faithful betrayal of Kant's legacy. Foucault looked at the world the Enlightenment built, and he rejected Kant's utopian implication that enlightenment was some finished, historical destination that humanity could just arrive at and comfortably reside in.
Right.
Foucault didn't believe in a world where perfectly rational citizens politely debate ideas in the public square while obeying just rulers in private.
Because Foucault understood power.
Exactly. Foucault argued that society is always constantly constructing invisible limits around the individual. Power in the modern world isn't just a king holding a sword, it is micropower.
Micropower.
It is the subtle, pervasive norms embedded in our schools, our hospitals, our prisons, and our psychology. It is the invisible web of language and societal expectations that dictates what is considered normal, what is considered sane, and what is considered acceptable behavior.
So how does Sapere Aude function in Foucault's worldview?
For Foucault, daring to know is an ongoing ethos. It is a permanent limit experience. It means you must constantly, relentlessly identify and deconstruct the invisible systems of power that are trying to define who you are.
It never ends.
Never. It's not about arriving at one ultimate, universal, rational truth, because Foucault doubted such a thing existed. It is about the exhausting daily courage to push against the boundaries of your own culturally constructed identity.
So Foucault tweaks and weaponizes the Enlightenment against its own institutions.
Yeah.
But Friedrich Nietzsche takes an absolute sledgehammer to the entire foundation. He doesn't want to tweak the Enlightenment. He wants to burn it to the ground and salt the earth.
Nietzsche's rejection is radical, uncompromising, and deeply unsettling. He looked backward at the giants of the Enlightenment, Descartes' obsession with logic, Kant's rigid moral frameworks, Rousseau's democratic politics, and he viewed all of it with profound contempt.
Contempt. Why?
Nietzsche argued that the entire Enlightenment project was a massive self-deception. He claimed it was essentially a secret, secularized version of the very Christianity it claimed to have defeated.
That is such a fascinating counterintuitive angle. How does Kant's logic equal religious dogma?
Well, Nietzsche viewed the Enlightenment as a rebellion of the weak. He believed that the mediocre masses were terrified of chaos and terrified of truly exceptional, powerful individuals. So they invented the concepts of universal reason and universal morality as a way to tie down the strong. He argued that Kant's supposedly objective autonomous reason was actually just Kant's unconscious subjective prejudices dressed up as universal laws. When Kant said, "This is the rational moral law for all humans," Nietzsche essentially replied, "No, that's just what a repressed 18th century Prussian professor prefers, and you are trying to force it on everyone else to make yourself feel safe."
This brings us to one of the most misunderstood parables in philosophy.
Right.
Nietzsche's story of the madman.
Oh, yes.
Most people know the quote, "God is dead," but they strip it of all its context. In the parable, the madman runs into the marketplace with a lantern in the morning, screaming that we have killed God. But he isn't celebrating. He is terrified.
Right, he's warning them.
He is asking, how are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun?
The madman reveals the terrifying void left behind by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment killed the divine guarantee of meaning, but it arrogantly assumed human reason could effortlessly fill the gap. Nietzsche is warning us that when you strip away the divine architect, there is no universal rational safety net to catch you. There is only the abyss.
So if reason is an illusion, what does Nietzsche think is actually driving human behavior?
For Nietzsche, human beings are not driven by some pure, noble desire for objective truth. We are driven by the will to power. We are driven by a primal urge to assert ourselves, to expand, and to impose our will over the world.
If that is the case, what on earth does Sapere Aude mean to a Nietzschean? If truth is a myth, what are we daring to know?
For Nietzsche, daring to know means having the terrifying, isolating courage to realize that truth itself is just an instrument of power. As he notoriously wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations."
Only interpretations.
The ultimate goal for Nietzsche is not to become a polite, rational, Kantian scholar contributing to society. The goal is to become the Übermensch, the overman.
The overman.
This is the rare individual who dares to look into the meaningless abyss, rejects all inherited morality, and creates their own values entirely from scratch. They embrace the eternal recurrence, the heavy burden of living your life in such a way, with such intense authenticity, that you would gladly choose to live that exact same life over and over again for all eternity.
That is an incredibly heavy philosophical shift. And it brings us to a very practical crisis point in our deep dive. If we follow Foucault and Nietzsche, if we accept that our reason is hopelessly flawed, that our institutions are just invisible cages, and that truth is merely a mask for power, doesn't telling people to Sapere Aude just turn everyone into arrogant, insufferable know-it-alls?
It's a real risk.
If there is no objective truth, doesn't my subjective opinion become absolute reality to me?
That is the precise danger of a misunderstood enlightenment. If you strip away the rigorous method of reason and only keep the rebellion, you get intellectual anarchy. This is why contemporary epistemology pairs the courage to know with a crucial balancing concept, epistemic humility.
Let's define epistemic humility clearly, because the word humility often carries a moralistic tone. It sounds like being meek or overly polite, which directly contradicts the bold, risky nature of daring to know.
It has nothing to do with being socially polite. Epistemic humility is a rigorous, rational, clinical acceptance of our own cognitive fallibility. It is understanding the strict biological limits of what the human mind can actually process.
Right, our biological limits.
In modern epistemology, there is a concept known as the humility thesis. It argues that human beings can only ever know the relational properties of the world. We can know how things interact with us, how light hits our retina, how gravity affects our mass, but we can never know the core, intrinsic, hidden essence of reality itself.
It's acknowledging the limits of our hardware. We're trying to run the infinite complex software of the universe on a 3-pound sponge of fat and water encased in a dark skull. We don't have direct access to reality. We only have access to our sensory interpretations. We are inevitably going to make processing errors.
Exactly. And when individuals or institutions forget this limitation when they operate with epistemic hubris, the social consequences are devastating.
The sources highlight a concept by the philosopher Christy Dodson that brilliantly explains how this hubris causes real-world harm. She writes about pernicious ignorance and testimonial smothering.
That is a very powerful concept.
It really is. This occurs when people in positions of authority are so epistemically arrogant, so absolutely certain that their worldview maps perfectly onto reality, that their ignorance actively harms vulnerable people. When a marginalized person tries to speak their truth, the arrogant authority figure's refusal to listen isn't just a disagreement. It acts as a form of epistemological violence. It literally smothers the testimony of the vulnerable before it can even be evaluated.
The text cites a harrowing real-world example to ground this concept, the 1993 Christchurch civic creche case in New Zealand. It is an incredibly complex, tragic legal case involving allegations of abuse at a childcare center. Without litigating the entire history, the epistemological lesson is profound. The testimonies of young children who are incredibly vulnerable epistemic subjects with their own ways of communicating were mishandled, heavily manipulated, and misunderstood by adult investigators who were absolutely certain of their own flawed methodologies.
They thought they knew best.
Exactly. The adults lacked epistemic humility. Because the children's testimonies didn't fit the rigid, preconceived models of reality the adults demanded, justice was compromised. When we lack the humility to say, my method might be flawed, we silence those who exist outside our models.
And we are seeing new, sophisticated dogmas emerge today that completely lack this humility. Look at the rise of naive realism in certain circles, the arrogant belief that our senses and our data show us the world exactly as it is without any subjective filter.
Or look at computationalism in the tech world.
Right. This is the incredibly arrogant assumption that the human mind is literally nothing more than a complex computer, and that consciousness is just an algorithm we will eventually be able to map and download onto a silicon chip.
These highly reductionist views become a new form of Kantian guardianship.
Yeah.
They say, we have the data, we have the algorithm, therefore we have the absolute truth. Stop questioning. So, true Sapere Aude today means daring to face the terrifying expanse of your own ignorance. It's the courage to look at your most deeply held belief and say, I might be fundamentally wrong about this.
To admit that your map of reality might be upside down is the ultimate act of intellectual courage.
It really is.
Which brings us crashing into the reality of the present day. We need to take all this abstract philosophy and apply it directly to the daily life of you, the listener, right now. Because, let's be honest, historical censorship, some king or pope issuing a decree telling you what books you aren't allowed to read, that is not our primary obstacle today.
No, the problem is inverted.
Our problem isn't a lack of information. It is info-obesity. We are drowning in a relentless tsunami of data. We are operating in what sociologists call the post-truth era.
We are. And to understand why the post-truth era is so destructive to the autonomous mind, we have to look under the hood at the psychological flaws that our modern digital environment is explicitly engineered to exploit.
Okay, let's look under the hood.
The human brain is riddled with cognitive biases. These biases are the modern invisible chains that Horace and Kant warned us about.
Let's pick two of the most damaging biases and look at how they work mechanically, because understanding the mechanism is the only way to dismantle it. First, let's look at confirmation bias. This isn't just preferring to be right.
No, it's deeper than that.
Mechanically, it is a filtering failure in the brain. It is our deep-seated tendency to eagerly seek out, remember, and amplify information that confirms what we already believe, while our brain literally ignores or instantly discounts evidence that contradicts us.
It's an energy-saving mechanism. As Kant noted, thinking is exhausting. Revising your worldview requires massive cognitive effort. So your brain protects you from that effort by simply filtering out the contradictory data before you even have to process it.
The second one is even more terrifying, the backfire effect. This completely shatters the Enlightenment assumption that humans are rational.
It really does.
Logically, if I believe something and you show me hard, irrefutable evidence that my belief is false, I should change my mind. But the backfire effect proves that often the exact opposite happens.
It's exactly the opposite.
When you show someone evidence that attacks a deeply held core belief, their brain perceives it as a literal physical threat. The amygdala fires. They go into a fight-or-flight response. The evidence doesn't change their mind. It causes them to defensively double down. And they end up believing the falsehood even more strongly than before you presented the facts.
We exhibit these behaviors because we are not at our core truth-seeking creatures. We are comfort-seeking creatures. We desperately want to avoid the pain of cognitive dissonance. We want to feel safe, we want to belong to our tribe, and we want to feel right.
And this brings us to the massive, chilling parallel of this entire deep dive. Just as Kant's contemporaries happily outsourced their thinking to the priest, the state bureaucrat, and the doctor, we're doing the exact same thing today. But our new guardians wear silicon.
Yes, big tech.
We have handed our autonomy over to big tech, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon. We outsource our spatial navigation to GPS. We outsource our memory to cloud storage. We are increasingly outsourcing our analytical writing and problem solving to generative AI like ChatGPT. We have voluntarily allowed opaque, profit-driven algorithms to become the new pastors and physicians of our minds.
The implications of the surrender are profound. What happens to a society when a handful of corporations control the unseen infrastructure of human thought? We are seeing the results right now.
We are.
We get the creation of hyper-customized echo chambers. These are algorithmic filter bubbles that trap users in hermetically sealed alternate realities. The algorithm realizes what keeps you engaged, usually anger, fear, or validation, and it micro-targets you with a relentless stream of content designed to trigger those precise neurochemical responses.
The mass delusions that spawn from these algorithmic echo chambers are mind-boggling, and they have real-world body counts. Our sources point to several recent examples. Look at the spread of absolute fabrications surrounding global health crises, like the wild lies about the Ebola outbreaks.
Or the Jade Helm 15 conspiracy.
The bizarre Jade Helm 15 conspiracy theory, where thousands of people were algorithmically radicalized into believing that a standard routine U.S. military exercise was actually a covert operation to impose martial law in Texas. And of course, the sprawling, gamified, alternate reality of QAnon.
It's terrifying.
We have to stop viewing these as quirky, fringe internet trends. They are massive, algorithmically fueled failures of Sapere Aude. They are what happens when a population loses the ability to independently verify reality.
And this epistemological vulnerability has been weaponized on a geopolitical scale. We are currently in the middle of a global information war, and it is a war over the nature of truth itself.
How so?
On one side, you have the traditional Western empirical approach, what we might call Kantian truth. This is the legacy of the Enlightenment. It's the belief that there is an objective reality, and we can discover it through rigorous reason, evidence, and good faith debate.
But the text notes a contrasting, incredibly destructive approach utilized by state actors, specifically referencing the Russian Sophia epistemology. How does that operate mechanically?
It operates by completely abandoning the goal of persuasion. In this model, information is not used to convince you of an alternative truth. It is used as a weapon of reflex control.
Reflex control.
Yes. The strategy is to flood the informational zone with so much contradictory, absurd, and emotionally charged noise that the target population becomes completely overwhelmed. The goal is to induce epistemic exhaustion.
So people just give up trying to figure out what's true.
Exactly. When people can no longer discern what is real, they become cynical, they withdraw from civic participation, and their capacity for rational collective action is completely paralyzed. You don't need to censor the truth if you can drown it in an ocean of static.
This means we are drifting rapidly away from Kant's ideal of public reason. We are moving toward what sociologists are calling predictive societies. In a predictive society, human behavior isn't guided by democratic debate or moral philosophy. It is anticipated, nudged, and managed by code.
Managed by code.
Your future isn't decided by your conscious choices. It's managed by algorithms analyzing your past data to predict your next click, your next purchase, or your next vote. So how do we fight back? If the algorithms are hacking our biology, what is the remedy?
The modern instantiation of Sapere Aude must take the form of profound digital literacy. If we want autonomous minds, we have to train them to navigate the specific hostile environment. The sources explicitly cite frameworks like the UNESCO AI Competency Framework as a necessary step.
So education needs to change.
The educational goal must shift. We have to transform students from being passive, reactive consumers of digital content into aggressive, critical thinkers. They need to understand exactly how an algorithm curates their feed, how their personal data is harvested and monetized, and crucially, how their own cognitive biases are being mapped and weaponized against them by the platforms they use every day.
That is the perfect transition into our final area of exploration today. If rigorous digital literacy is the new Sapere Aude, we have to look critically at the institutions tasked with molding these minds. We need to look at the traditional citadels of reason, the universities.
It is deeply ironic, but also historically fitting, that so many prestigious universities around the world literally use Sapere Aude as their official motto.
They really do.
You see it carved into the stone crests of institutions across the globe, universities in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Paris, across the United States, and historic grammar schools in the UK. They proudly display this Latin call to intellectual courage as their guiding star.
But as our sources suggest, displaying the motto and practicing it are two very different things. There is a massive systemic crisis in modern higher education right now. We are witnessing a fierce, existential clash between two fundamentally incompatible educational models.
Yes, the liberal arts versus utilitarianism.
Right. On one side, you have the traditional holistic liberal arts education. And we must be clear here, liberal in this context doesn't mean left-wing political affiliations. It comes from artes liberales, the skills required for a free person to participate in civic life.
Exactly.
It's about liberating the mind through the broad study of history, philosophy, literature, and culture. It teaches the interconnectedness of human knowledge. The text quotes the visionary poet William Blake, who perfectly summarized this global interdependence. No living thing lives alone, nor for itself.
On the competing side, representing a severe and growing threat to the liberal arts, is the hyper-pragmatic, deeply utilitarian model of education.
And what does that look like?
This model abandons the goal of shaping well-rounded, philosophically grounded citizens. Instead, it views the university merely as an expensive, highly specialized job training facility designed to produce compliant workers for the corporate machinery.
The text highlights a jarring, almost comical contrast that perfectly illustrates this ideological shift. We see modern universities pouring massive amounts of funding and resources into highly specific, immediately monetizable programs like motorsports management.
Motorsports management, right.
Meanwhile, these same institutions are systematically defunding their philosophy and humanities departments or treating them as frivolous leisure studies. It is a tragic realization of the warning issued by the writer C.S. Lewis.
What did she say?
He observed that when heavily market-obsessed, utilitarian minds encounter pure knowledge or theoretical exploration that cannot be immediately packaged and monetized, they don't just ignore it. They view it with hostility. They declare it to be bunk. They see no value in a thought that doesn't generate quarterly profit.
But the threat to intellectual courage on campus isn't solely driven by external market forces or corporate funding models. There is a new, highly concerning internal dogmatism rising within the academy itself. Our sources identify the cultural phenomena often described as cancel culture and extreme wokeism as potential new forms of epistemological despotism.
The source material navigates this tension very clearly, and it's a tension we must report accurately. On one hand, the drive to fight real systemic issues like historical racism, sexism, and institutional bigotry on campus is absolutely vital. Bringing marginalized voices into the academic discourse is a direct extension of the Enlightenment's goal of universal human dignity.
Absolutely.
However, the sources point out that the movement violently derails its own stated goals when it adopts the authoritarian tactics of the very tyrants it claims to oppose. The text specifically notes instances where the movement abandons debate and turns to coercion.
Coercion over debate.
When a campus culture begins systematically silencing dissenting voices, the sources specifically mention the intense ostracization faced by conservative health students in certain cohorts, or when students shut down controversial visiting speakers through physical intimidation, administrative deplatforming, or mob pressure rather than engaging in dismantling their arguments with superior logic. The university has failed its core mission.
The psychologist Michael Carson is quoted in the text with a chilling, historically accurate observation. He says, "Every movement tends to become what it hates."
Wow. Every movement tends to become what it hates.
If a movement built on the demand for tolerance becomes violently intolerant of intellectual diversity, it hasn't achieved liberation. It has merely installed a new set of Kantian guardians. The dogma has changed, but the demand for unquestioning obedience remains the same.
The ultimate unvarnished takeaway here is that the university's job is not to provide a perfectly comfortable, intellectually sterilized, safe space where your pre-existing beliefs are never challenged and your worldview is constantly validated.
No, it isn't.
The fundamental job of the university is to force students to navigate the uncomfortable, jagged, highly dangerous edges of human knowledge. It is supposed to be difficult. It is supposed to induce cognitive dissonance. That is exactly what daring to know means.
We must remember the lesson of Horace's River. Growth only happens at the boundary of the unknown. And navigating that boundary requires the courage to be offended, the humility to realize you are wrong, and the resilience to continuously reconstruct your map of reality.
This has been a massive, sprawling, intense journey today. Let's take a moment to summarize the odyssey we've been on. We started on the muddy banks of a Roman river with Horace's foolish rustic, learning that the pursuit of knowledge requires action and risk, not perpetual procrastination.
Then we stood in the dark with Galileo.
Right, as his primitive telescope shattered the perfectly ordered divine spheres of the heavens, defying the Inquisition in the name of empirical reality. We sat in Kant's obsessively neat study as he diagnosed humanity's willful cowardice and drafted the blueprints for a subversive intellectual rebellion.
A rebellion that eventually bled into the law books of the world and gave birth to our universal human rights.
Exactly. Then we faced the terrifying abyss with Foucault and Nietzsche, realizing that our reason is flawed and that power hides in every social structure. And finally, we waded into the murky, algorithmically manipulated post-truth waters of our modern digital echo chambers. The through line connecting all of this is clear. Sapere Aude is a painful process.
It's very painful.
It requires immense, continuous effort. It can be incredibly socially isolating, but ultimately, it is the only viable path to possessing a genuinely free mind.
The challenge for every single one of us listening today is to consciously wake up from the algorithm's lullaby. We must actively refuse to let the machines, the political pundits, the social media mobs, and the prevailing cultural orthodoxies prepackage and provide all the answers for us. We must dare to ask the disruptive, dangerous questions ourselves.
And that brings me to a final provocative thought. I want to leave you with a concept for you to mull over long after this deep dive comes to an end. Throughout this discussion, we talked about the dangers of outsourcing our thinking to algorithms and glowing screens that we hold in our hands.
Right.
But what happens when the technology removes that physical barrier and moves inside of us? If brain-computer interfaces like Neuralink eventually succeed in merging our biological neurology directly with cloud computing, at what precise point does your own understanding end and the machine's predictive algorithm begin?
That is the question.
In a rapidly approaching transhumanist future where our thoughts are digitally augmented, will the ultimate act of Sapere Aude require us to literally, physically disconnect our brains from the collective digital grid just to know who we really are?
It is a terrifying, staggering, but absolutely necessary question for the century ahead.
Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.